Fear. The story of Alexander the Great begins, not with a throne, not with a crown, but with a vision. A vision that began on the night of his birth, in 356 BCE, in the Macedonian city of Pella. Legends say that the gods themselves stirred that night. The great temple of Artemis burned mysteriously, and prophets whispered of a child who was destined to change the course of history. That child was Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. No one yet knew it, but this boy would rise to hold half the known world in his grasp before the age of 30. Alexander's mother was a strong, proud woman who saw her son's birth as a sign from the gods. From the moment he could walk, she dressed him in fine robes and jewelry and paraded him around the palace like a little king. All hail, mighty Alexander! As a boy, he was tutored by the best minds in Macedonia. He learned about philosophy and literature, history and geography, science and math, but his favorite subject was warfare. He loved to watch the soldiers train, and he begged his father for a horse so he could join them. When Alexander was 13, his father, King Philip, finally gave him what he wanted most, a horse. And so began Alexander's lifelong love affair with horses. He rode them everywhere, even to school. One day, while riding his horse Bucephalus through the streets of Pella, young Alexander saw a group of men arguing over who was the greatest warrior of all time. Without hesitation, Alexander jumped off his horse, marched up to the men, and shouted, "I am the greatest warrior in the world. B." The men laughed at him, but Alexander didn't care. He knew that one day they would all remember his name. And they did. As a child, Alexander was restless. He did not walk through life as other children did. He ran, leaped, questioned, challenged. His mother, Olympias, told him stories of Achilles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology, and planted in him the burning belief that he was meant for something extraordinary. His father, Philip, was a mighty warrior and conqueror, uniting Greece under Macedonian power. Between his mother's divine ambition and his father's worldly success, Alexander was caught between two powerful flames. But perhaps the greatest influence on his young mind came in the form of a teacher. At just 13, Alexander was placed under the tutelage of Aristotle, the philosopher whose wisdom had reached every corner of Greece. Under Aristotle, Alexander learned not only about politics and war, but about philosophy, ethics, poetry, medicine, and the stars. The boy was shaped into a thinker as well as a fighter. He was taught that true greatness was not just in ruling men, but in understanding the world, in bringing together knowledge and power. This combination, sword and philosophy, ambition and wisdom, would make Alexander unlike any king before him. Money. One story from his youth reveals the kind of man he was destined to be. When Alexander was 12, his father purchased a powerful, untamed horse. The animal Bucephalus was so wild that none could ride him, and even Philip declared him useless. But Alexander, watching carefully, realized that the horse was frightened of its own shadow. He turned Bucephalus toward the sun so no shadow would fall, mounted him with fearless grace, and tamed the beast before all eyes. The people cheered. Philip wept with pride and declared, "My son, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." It was a prophecy more accurate than anyone could have guessed. Tragedy and opportunity struck when Alexander was just 20 years old. His father, Philip II, was assassinated, and the weight of an empire fell upon his shoulders. Many doubted the young prince, believing him too inexperienced to hold the throne. The enemies stirred, rebellions rose, and foreign rivals prepared to test him. But Alexander silenced every doubt with speed and fire. He crushed revolts in Greece, stormed rebellious cities into submission, and within months, the boy was no longer questioned. He was a king, a warrior, a leader. But Alexander's gaze was already fixed beyond his father's empire. Across the sea, the Persian Empire stretched vast and mighty, ruled by King Darius III. It was the richest and most powerful kingdom on earth, its borders spanning from Egypt to India. To challenge Persia was madness. Yet Alexander, in the bloom of youth armed with confidence and destiny, swore he would take it. He was not content with ruling Greece. He wanted to rule the world. Through In 334 BCE, Alexander marched east with an army of 40,000 men. They were few compared to Persia's might, but what they lacked in numbers they made up in loyalty and discipline. Alexander led not from the rear, but from the front. He shared the hardships of his soldiers, eating their food, marching in their dust, fighting in their ranks. To them, he was not just a king, he was their brother in arms, and they would follow him into the jaws of hell itself. The first test came at the river Granicus. The Persian satraps met Alexander with a force meant to crush him at the very border. But Alexander charged into the river, spear flashing, cutting down enemies as if fate itself was his shield. The Persians broke, and Asia Minor lay open. The young conqueror had made his mark, but the true clash awaited. In 333 BCE. At the narrow plains near Issus, Alexander met King Darius himself. The Persian army dwarfed his own, stretching as far as the eye could see. Yet Alexander, fearless, drove his cavalry in a wedge, cutting deep into the heart of the Persian line. Chaos spread, and Darius panicked, fled the field, abandoning his family. When his wife, mother, and daughters were brought before Alexander, the world expected humiliation or cruelty. Instead, Alexander treated them with dignity, honoring them as royalty. In that moment, he showed he was not merely a conqueror, but a man who understood honor. His fame exploded. Nations surrendered at his approach. Cities opened their gates. In Egypt, he was hailed not as an invader, but as a liberator. At the Oracle of Siwa, priests declared him the son of Zeus himself. Alexander, already believing in his divine destiny, embraced the title. He founded a city on the Nile, Alexandria, that would shine as a beacon of culture for centuries. But Persia was not yet fully broken. In 331 BCE, at the plains of Gaugamela, Darius assembled one last, massive army, complete with war elephants and scythed chariots. It was a battle of titans. The Persians outnumbered Alexander several times over, but Alexander's strategy was genius. He lured the Persians into stretching their line, then pierced their center with a lightning strike. Once again, Darius fled, and the mighty Persian Empire collapsed. Alexander marched into Babylon, into Persepolis, into the heart of Persia. The world that had once trembled before Persia now knelt before him. Yet Alexander was not satisfied. He dreamed not only of conquest, but of unity, of blending East and West into one empire. He married a Persian princess, encouraged his soldiers to do the same, and envisioned a world without divisions, ruled under one crown, one law, one culture. His ambition was no longer merely land, it was eternity. And still, he marched onward, toward the mysterious lands of the East, where another chapter of his destiny awaited. Though Alexander had conquered the mighty Persian Empire, a realm once thought untouchable. He had walked into Babylon as a king, sat on the throne of Darius, and carried the treasures of Persepolis as his prize. For most men, this would have been enough. For most kings, the glory of toppling Persia would have been the crown of their achievements. But Alexander was not like other men. His ambition burned hotter than fire, his hunger greater than any kingdom could satisfy. He believed that if the world could be seen, it could be conquered, and if it could be conquered, it could be unified. And so, his eyes turned further east, two lands whispered of in Greece, but rarely seen. The mysterious subcontinent of India. Tales spoke of kingdoms rich in gold and elephants as tall as fortresses, of rivers as wide as seas, of people both fierce and noble. For Alexander, it was not curiosity alone, but destiny itself that called him forward. He would push beyond the known world, into the lands where the sun seemed to rise. In 327 BCE, Alexander led his army through the towering Hindu Kush mountains. The path was brutal. Snow blinded the men, avalanches swallowed them, and bitter winds froze even the hardiest soldier. Yet Alexander pressed on, encouraging his men by sharing in every hardship. He walked when they walked, shivered when they shivered, bled when they bled. His army cursed their fate but followed, bound by loyalty to their king, who never asked them to endure what he would not endure himself. At last, they descended into the Punjab region of India. Here, Alexander met resistance unlike any before. The local kings fought with courage, and their warriors used tactics unfamiliar to the Macedonians. But Alexander, with his unshakable brilliance, adapted swiftly. One by one, the smaller kingdoms fell. Yet the greatest challenge awaited at the banks of the Hydaspes River, where a king named Porus stood ready. Porus was no ordinary king. He was a giant of a man, tall and proud, commanding an army unlike anything Alexander had faced. At his side stood hundreds of war elephants, beasts that the Macedonian soldiers had never fought before. These elephants, armored and terrifying, could trample men and horses with equal ease, and they struck fear into even the bravest heart. The river was flooded, its currents fierce, and Porus had taken a strong position on the far side. To cross and fight seemed impossible, but Alexander was never one to bow to impossibility. In the dead of night, under heavy rain, he led a secret crossing upstream with part of his army. At dawn, his troops stormed across the riverbank, surprising Porus and forcing the battle into motion. What followed was one of the most brutal struggles of Alexander's life. The elephants charged, their tusks gleaming with sharpened iron, their massive bodies crushing men underfoot. Macedonian horses panicked at the sight and smell of the beasts. Yet Alexander's men held their ground, with arrows, javelins, and sheer determination. They attacked the elephants, while Alexander himself, as always, rode at the front. Hours passed in blood and chaos, until at last, the Macedonian discipline began to turn the tide. Porus fought with unmatched valor, refusing to retreat even when wounded, even when his army collapsed around him. At last, defeated but not broken, he was captured and brought before Alexander the Conqueror, looked upon the proud Indian king and asked, "Tell me, Porus, how should I treat you?" Porus, his wounds bleeding, yet his dignity unshaken, replied, "Treat me as a king would treat another king." Alexander, struck by the nobility of this answer, not only spared Porus, but restored his kingdom to him, granting him even more territory than before. In that moment, two great warriors recognized each other's greatness. And Alexander proved once more that he sought not just to conquer, but to win hearts and allies. But his men were weary. They had marched for nearly a decade, across deserts, mountains, rivers, and endless battlefields. At the banks of the River Bees, deeper into India, the soldiers finally refused to go on. They longed for home, for their families, for rest. They loved Alexander, but even their loyalty had limits. For the first time, Alexander's will collided with the immovable wall of his army's exhaustion. The king raged, pleaded, and even sulked, but his men would not move further. With heavy heart, Alexander agreed to turn back. His dream of conquering all of India, perhaps even reaching the mysterious Eastern Oceans, was left unfinished. Yet his return was no triumphal march. Instead, he chose the harshest path home, the Jedrosian Desert, in modern-day Iran. The desert was merciless. Heat scorched the men by day, freezing winds punished them by night, and water was so scarce that entire companies perished of thirst. When a helmet of water was once brought to Alexander, he poured it out on the sand before his men, declaring he would not drink if they could not. Such gestures bound his soldiers to him even in despair, but thousands still died on the brutal journey. Finally, in 324 BCE, Alexander returned to Persia, battered but unbeaten. He had achieved what no man before him had: an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt, from Babylon to India. Yet even at the height of his power, he was restless. He dreamed of new campaigns, of exploring Arabia, of reaching lands unknown. He also sought to bind his empire together, blending East and West into one sea. He married Roxana, a princess from Bactria, and encouraged his officers to marry Persian women. He dressed in Persian robes at times, to the discomfort of his Greek companions. But he believed in creating a single world where Greek and Persian, East and West, were one. But destiny had other plans. In 323 BCE, in the city of Babylon, as Alexander prepared for new campaigns, he was struck by sudden illness. Fever consumed him, and within days, the strongest man on earth lay weak upon his bed. His generals gathered, desperate for guidance. When asked to whom he left his vast empire, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." They leaned closer, but his voice was fading. his strength gone. At the age of 32, Alexander the Great, who had marched across continents and bent nations to his will, breathed his last. His death was like the shattering of a star. The empire he built could not survive without him. His generals divided it, each taking a piece, and his dream of one united world crumbled. Yet, his legend did not die. His name echoed in every land he had touched, and his story inspired generations. For centuries, emperors, kings, and conquerors would look to Alexander as the model of greatness. As the man who proved that with courage and vision, the impossible could be made real. Alexander lived only 32 years, ruled for barely more than a decade, yet achieved what men with lifetimes could not. He carved the largest empire of the ancient world, spread Greek culture across continents, and planted seeds of knowledge, art, and philosophy that would grow for centuries. Even now, over 2,000 years later, his name carries the weight of destiny. Who was more than a man, more than a king. He was an idea, a flame that could not be contained, a vision that stretched as far as the horizon. And though time claimed his body, his story remains immortal. Alexander the Great, the boy who became a legend, the king who dreamed of the world, the conqueror who tried to hold eternity in his hands. To those who enjoy the story, share your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like to hear more interesting stories, let me know in the comments.